Hello everyone and welcome to Blender. Blender is a fantastic open source software that is mostly known for its 3D animation and modeling capabilities. It's a very powerful software that's been used in feature films, games, TV series, and a bunch of other amazing projects such as the ones you see here. But it can also do much more than that. Video editing, compositing, painting, sculpting, visual effects, cloth simulation, particle simulation, fluid and smoke simulations, 3D printing, and as of recently, 2D animation and real-time rendering. So, if you want to learn about any of these, you've come to the right place. This video series will serve as an encyclopedia of sorts for the fundamentals of Blender. In the next few videos, I'll be going over certain topics that should be helpful for both beginners and veteran Blender users, especially with the recent update. So, I hope you find these videos helpful, and I'll see you all soon. So how do we navigate Blender? This may seem intimidating at first, but it's actually pretty simple. Let's start with the 3D viewport. The first thing you'll be curious about is how to select things. Simply left-click any object to select it, and left-click empty space to deselect. You can also press A to select all, and Alt-A to deselect all. Some users may be interested in right-click select, which is arguably better for your health, so we made a separate video about that if you are curious. The next thing you'll want to learn is the basics of navigation, how to rotate, how to pan, and how to zoom your perspective of the viewport. To do that, all you need are these buttons right here. So let's say we want to rotate around our cube. Luckily, we have a very handy gizmo in the top right of our viewport that looks like this. Notice how it responds to our cursor floating above each axis. Go ahead and hover over the blue Z-axis indicator and left click. You'll notice that it brings you directly into what's called top orthographic view. This can be done for any axis to snap to its corresponding perspective. However, if you instead click and drag the same gizmo, you'll find a much more flexible way of rotating your view of the world. It's important for some to know that you can also middle click drag to achieve the same effect, but from any cursor position. Now, you'll notice that our view seems to pivot around a particular point in the viewport, that being the center or origin of our grid. This also happens to be where our cube is at the moment. However, what if we didn't want to look at the cube? What if we wanted to look over here or something? Well, now all you have to do is click this hand icon and drag to where you want to have centered. From there, you'll notice your pivot has changed when you rotate your perspective. For hotkey users, simply hold Shift and middle mouse drag to achieve the same effect, but from any cursor position. But let's say I want to focus back on my cube again. How do we do that? Well, for that, I want to quickly show you the Frame Selected tool, which can be found under View. This will reframe your perspective to focus on the object or objects you have selected. This can also be achieved by using the period key on a number pad. Now that we're this close to our cube, you may be asking, how do we zoom in and out? But it's pretty self-explanatory. We have a magnifying glass here. Click and drag it to zoom in and out, or you can use the scroll wheel or plus and minus keys on the numpad to accomplish the same task. And that's basically it for the basics of navigation, but you may have noticed that we haven't used the other two buttons in this area, the camera icon and the grid icon. The camera icon will bring you into the eyes of your camera. This is very helpful for setting up camera angles and previewing what will eventually be your output image. Alternatively, you can also use 0 on the number pad. The fourth button here is a grid. This may confuse you at first, but this switches your viewport between orthographic mode and perspective mode. I went ahead and set up a scene here to make it more obvious to you, but you may be asking, what's the difference between these two modes? Well, perspective mode is a realistic view of the 3D objects in your scene, which takes into account how far away objects are from you into how it displays the object. The further away something is, the smaller it gets visually. However, orthographic mode ignores all of that and flattens your world so that no perspective is seen. Everything is angle perfect. This is an unrealistic view but helps immensely with making models accurate, especially in relation to, say, a 2D concept sketch. But that's just the viewport. In the next video, I'll be talking about all the different windows we see here, what they do, and how to navigate them as well. Blender provides a lot of information with its interface, and can be flexible enough to fit the workflow you need. Let's go over some of the basics on how to interpret and interact with Blender's UI. Before we begin, I want to point out that there is a very handy display at the very bottom of the user interface. This is an informative display that lets you know what each click can do in the context your cursor is at the moment. It also applies to when certain hotkeys are being held down to change the function of certain clicks. For example, if you hold Shift, you can see the information at the bottom changing. It tells us that without holding Shift, your middle mouse button rotates your perspective, but holding Shift pans your perspective. Feel free to refer to this display at any time while watching this series or playing around with Blender to learn more of its features. As a quick reference, here are what some of the mouse icons translate to. Now, the next big thing you'll notice is that each important section of the UI is separated into panels. These panels are scalable if you click and drag any of the boundaries, and they can also be whatever you'd like them to be. Simply click the drop-down menu in the top left or bottom left of a panel and select a different type of editor. You can also create more panels by right-clicking a boundary, clicking Split Area, and then left-clicking at a position of the screen you desire. To delete a panel, simply right-click a boundary, click Join Area, and left-click over the panel you'd like to overwrite. Additionally, if you would ever like to maximize a panel to focus on it, simply mouse over an area and press Ctrl Space. You can also press Ctrl Space again to return. While this is extremely powerful, Blender also provides default workspaces you can choose from that set up the appropriate editors for specific workflows. You can find these workspace options in the tabs above. For hotkey users, you can press Ctrl Page Up or Ctrl Page Down. We will be going over each of these workspaces in future videos. However, for this video, we will focus on the primary editors of the Layout workspace. Further introduction of other editors will be given in editor-specific videos. So, let's begin. If you saw our viewport navigation video, then you already know what the viewport is. This is where our 3D scene is displayed. In this editor, you can perform a variety of tasks that interact with your 3D scene and its objects. However, it's important to note that there are two helpful quick menus in the viewport. Simply press T as in Tools, or left-click this arrow here to expand the Quick Tools menu for the viewport. This includes tools such as the Select Box, Move, Rotate, and Scale. For hotkey users, keep in mind you can also use Shift Space at any time to bring up the same tools menu but labeled and at your cursor location. This works similarly to a pie menu in that you have the option to hold the Shift Space hotkey, move your cursor to the tool you want, and release the hotkey to select a tool. You can also press N as in number or left-click the arrow on the right to open additional quick settings, which include your item's transformation data, tool-specific settings, and other viewport options. You'll notice here there is an option for the 3D cursor. This is a very powerful tool which you can see right here. This red and white circle acts as the spawning point for any new objects and can be used as a reference for pivoting, which we'll go over in another video. To place it around your scene, simply hold Shift and right-click. To recenter the cursor, simply press Shift S and select Cursor to World Origin from the pie menu, or adjust the location and rotation settings in the right-hand side quick menu. Now, this feels like a good time to explain what pie menus are for those who are unfamiliar. Pie menus are quick wheel menus that appear around your cursor after a hotkey is pressed. You have three options when navigating a pie menu. The first option is to right-click to cancel in case you changed your mind. The second option is to press and hold the hotkey to initiate the pie menu, drag your cursor to your desired choice, then let go of the hotkey to select, with no clicking necessary. Or the third option is to let go of the hotkey that initiated the pie menu before moving your cursor, then use your cursor to left-click select the option you like. After you get used to where each option is, this can greatly speed up your workflow while also making several options available with less keystrokes. Throughout this series, you will see pie menus quite often for various different contexts. Now below the viewport we have the timeline. This controls playback of your animation. You can zoom in and out with your scroll wheel, drag the timeline with your middle mouse button, change the start and end frames for your output, and create and manipulate keyframes, all of which we'll go over in another video. The Properties editor contains several tabs vertically to display the properties of your scene, your current tool, and whatever object you have selected. To start at the top, this first tab represents the options your currently selected tool in the viewport may have. In this case, the Select Box tool gives you a few different selection options. The next few tabs, which you can see are separated by a small gap, contain your scene-specific properties. Just to clarify, your scene refers to your entire 3D scene. However, you can create more than one scene in a single Blender file by clicking up here. You can also select a scene from existing scenes using this drop-down. This back-facing camera icon is your Render tab. This allows you to change render engines, sampling, engine-specific properties, and other properties that affect your final image and how it's interpreted from the 3D scene. The next icon looks like a printer, and this is your Output tab. This is where all of your output settings can be tweaked before render: resolution, frame rate, file path, file type, and much more. The icon that looks like a stack of photos is the View Layer tab, and is similar to what used to be called render layers. View layers are typically used to separate background and character passes, for example, for easy compositing after render. However, you'll notice this is only the pass properties, not the objects, and it's for only one view layer, the one we're currently in. To select a different view layer to change its properties, you'll need to go up here, similar to creating a new scene. You can create and select existing view layers here. While we're on the topic, I'd like to point out what this panel above Properties is for. In order to specify which collections of objects are rendered out in each view layer, you can check and uncheck collections here in what's called the Outliner. I highly recommend using descriptive names for your collections and view layers by double-clicking them, but we will go over this in another video. Next, we have the General Scene tab. This has other miscellaneous scene properties that affect your scene, such as your active camera, your units, and rigid body settings. Finally, the Globe icon is the final tab of this section and is called the World tab. This includes properties for the sky and air of your scene. In other words, the surface option for your world is the shader used for your sky or background color, while Volume allows for volumetric lighting throughout the atmosphere of your scene as a whole, such as fog or mist. For the next section, the property tabs will be specific to the active object you have selected. So in this case, I will select the cube. Our first tab is the Object tab. This contains basic information such as location, rotation, and scale of the object. You can also specify parent-child relationships, which collections it belongs to, and visibility of the object. The next tab is a very important tab for Blender. Represented by a wrench icon, the Modifiers tab allows for powerful manipulation of objects using predefined modifiers. Simply select a modifier from the drop-down menu to add it to the stack below. You can use as many modifiers as you like and change the order or application of these modifications using these arrows. For example, the Subdivision Surface modifier and the Bevel modifier. This next tab is the Particles tab. You can see the icon looks like an object shooting particles out from its main body. In here, you can create particle systems and add them to the object you have selected. Next is the Physics tab, which looks like an orbiting planet icon. This contains several different types of physics simulations and physics manipulators, including cloth, rigid body, smoke, fluid, collision, and force fields such as wind. The next icon looks like two objects wrapped together. This represents the Constraints tab. This tab is very similar to the Modifiers tab, but deals more so with relationships of the objects you have selected with other objects or values, rather than manipulating the object by itself. You can have an object copy the location of another object with the Copy Location constraint, stay above the ground with the Floor constraint, or point at another object with the Tracking constraints. The green triangle icon is for your object's mesh data. To explain what mesh data is, I can tell you that the reason why our cube is a cube is because of the mesh data. If I were to take this exact same object and change the mesh data, its shape would not be the same, but its object properties such as its location would remain the same. Here you can manipulate your vertex groups, also known as weight maps, your shape keys, also known as blend shapes, and your UV maps. Other geometry specific settings belong here as well. And finally, we have our Material tab. This is represented by a material sphere icon and is where you control much of how your object is shaded during render. The material you choose here will affect how shiny your object is. what color it is, and how rough it may appear to be. The final tab is actually in a different section, as you can see. There's a small gap there. This is the Texture tab, represented with a checkered canvas icon, and is not object specific. Textures exist as separate entities that can be referenced for a number of things, including the world, aka skybox, materials, or brushes. Because of this ubiquity, they are in a separate section. Before we move on, let's go ahead and left-click to select our lamp object. This is the dotted circular thing you see next to our cube. Once you have that selected, you'll have access to its lamp properties, which looks like a light bulb. This is where you can tweak its brightness, the radius of light, whether or not it casts shadows, and what type of lamp it is. We can also left-click to select our camera object, which is this sideways rectangular pyramid shape we have here. Now you should have access to the camera options, which include focal length, perspective type, and much more. And that's the summary for the default layout workspace we see when we open Blender. I hope this is helpful for you, and I'll be going into more detail about the other workspaces and what each editor does in separate videos. Selecting objects in Blender is quite simple. We already went over it in the viewport navigation video, but to quickly review, left-click an object to select it, and left-click empty space to deselect. But there are other selection tools as well. You can press A, for example, to select all, and Alt-A to deselect all. However, what if I want to select multiple objects, but not all of them? Well, for that there is the Select Box tool. This is turned on by default, and with it selected from the Quick Tools menu, you can left-click drag to select multiple objects at once. To deselect multiple objects at once, simply Control-click drag in the same way. You can also enable the Box Select tool with the B hotkey, but in that mode you'll be using middle-click drag to deselect objects. An alternative to the Select Box is to press C for Circle Select, which acts more like a selection brush, and only extends selection by default. You can, however, still use middle mouse drag to deselect while in circle select mode. Another way to select multiple objects is by simply holding Shift and left-clicking objects individually. To deselect using this method, simply Shift left-click the object again until it's no longer highlighted. You may notice that while you Shift left-click these objects, the most recently selected one is always highlighted in a slightly brighter orange outline. This denotes which object is the active object. The active object is the object whose properties will appear in the Properties editor. Now, just a quick tip. If you have objects or geometry obscured by other objects or geometry, it may be difficult to select them. To help with this, I recommend using wireframe mode, located here, to see through your objects. This makes things easier to select and also allows for selection tools like Box and Circle Select to include otherwise obstructed objects or geometry. Now, it's important to know that each of these selection tools can be used for almost every context in Blender, including Edit Mode, Pose Mode, and many of the editors. However, in some editors you will be required to press B before entering box selection mode, such as the Outliner. You may have also noticed a Select menu in the top left of the viewport. If you open this menu, you'll notice several selection options laid out for you, as well as some viewport-specific selection options, such as Select All by Type, Select Active Camera, Select Linked, and more. Feel free to try these out yourself, but it's important to know that Select More/Less only works in Edit mode, which we'll get into in a separate video. Now that we know how to select objects, let's start transforming them. Transformation refers to moving things, rotating things, or scaling things. So, let's say I want to push or pull my cube to a different location. This would be classified as moving the cube or translating the cube. I can open the Quick Tools menu and select the Move tool. You'll notice 3 colored arrows and 3 colored squares appearing on your selected object. This will allow me to click and drag any of the arrows to move the selected object along that axis. If you select any one of the 3 squares, it will move the object along 2 axes, excluding the axis of its corresponding color. For example, the blue square excludes the blue z-axis movement, but moves your object along the x and y axes simultaneously. But you can also left-click drag anywhere in the viewport to move the object along your viewing plane. Now, in case you change your mind about moving your object after you've already started dragging it, simply right-click before letting go of your left mouse button. This will work for all transformations. For hotkey users, you can press G as in grab to initiate the move along your viewing plane. You can then press X, Y, or Z to move it along a specific axis like the colored arrows did. Or you can hold Shift and press X, Y, or Z to move it along the other two axes like the colored squares did. You can right-click at any time to cancel the move, or left-click to apply the new location to your object. Fun fact, if you initiate any transformation with the mouse click instead of the hotkey, you can still use the X, Y, or Z hotkeys to perform similar axis-specific constraints on your transformation before you release your left mouse button. You can also switch your transformation entirely to a different one, such as rotation or scale, with their respective hotkeys. Please read the display at the bottom of your window while dragging your object around for more information. To reset the location of your object back to its origin point, simply press Alt-G. Now, what if we want to tip our cube over or roll it around? In order to do that, we need to rotate our cube. Let's check our quick menus for that. Aha! Yes, it seems we do have a rotate tool here as well. This will display a gizmo over the selected object or objects, showing each rotational axis. Just like the move tool, you can left-click drag any of the colored rings to rotate along a single axis. But you'll notice there are two new areas, the outer white ring and the inner sphere inside of the colored rings, which you'll notice if you hover over it. The outer white ring can be used to rotate the object along your viewing vector. Imagine your eyes drilling a hole into the center of the object and spinning the object around that axis of rotation. The inner sphere is what you see when you hover over the space in between the colored rings. This can be left-click dragged to enter a free rotation mode, which opens all three axes to rotation, kind of like a trackball on a trackball mouse. This is my favorite mode of rotation as it's the most flexible. For hotkey users, simply press R as in rotate to initiate the rotation along your viewing vector. You can then, once again, press X, Y, or Z to rotate along the specific axis like the colored rings did. But you can also hit R again to initiate a free rotation like the inner sphere trackball did. And again, you can right-click at any time to cancel the rotation or left-click to apply the new rotation to your object. To reset your object's rotation at any time, simply press Alt-R. Now, let's say we want to make our cube much bigger or much smaller, which can be the difference between, say, a tissue box and a house. This would be known as scaling our cube. So let's go check our Quick Tools menu again, and yes, a scale tool. Selecting this scale tool displays a gizmo very similar to the move tool, except instead of colored arrows, it's like colored arrows with cubes of cheese stuck on the tips of them. Cheese. These work exactly the way you might expect. Simply left-click drag any of the colored axes to scale the object along that particular direction, big or small. You can also left-click drag the colored squares to exclude one axis from the scaling process. But what if you want to scale the entire object evenly? Just like moving, you simply left-click drag anywhere in the viewport. For hotkey users, press the S key as in scale to initiate the size change evenly for all axes. Press X, Y, or Z to scale along only a single axis, just like the colored arrows with cheese on them did, or press Shift X, Y, or Z to exclude an axis from the scaling, just like the colored squares did. You can right-click at any time to cancel the resizing, or left-click to apply the new size of your object. To reset the scale of your object back to its original scale, simply press Alt-S. Now, you may have noticed that during the rotation and scale procedures, there was a definitive center or pivot to the transformations. This is usually what the orange dot on your object signifies. However, what if you don't want to rotate or scale based on the object's pivot point? What if you want to rotate from the world origin or scale upwards relative to the floor level? That's where the 3D cursor comes in. This red and white circle is called the 3D cursor. It can act as the pivot point of any object as long as you click this drop-down menu here and select 3D cursor. Try it out with rotation and scale modes. You can move the 3D cursor throughout your scene by selecting the 3D cursor tool in the Quick Tool menu and left-click dragging anywhere in your scene, or pressing Shift right-click. You can change the pivot point back to the default median point at any time with the same menu as before. The 3D cursor can also be used for moving your object. I personally love this feature for quick moving your object to a specific point. Simply move your 3D cursor to where you want your object to go. Then go to Object, Snap, Selection to Cursor. For hotkey users, you can simply press Shift right-click and then Shift S and use the pie menu to select Selection to Cursor. Just a friendly reminder, if you ever need to recenter your 3D cursor, Cursor to World Origin is also in the same Snap menu. Okay, now let's say I've run into the issue where I've rotated my object, but now I can't move the object along its own upwards axis. I'm stuck moving directly up, and that's not helpful. Don't worry, all you have to do is change this drop-down menu up here from global to local. This will change all gizmos to display the object's local axes instead of the global axes for all transformations. For hotkey users, you can access local axes simply by pressing X, Y, or Z twice instead of once after initiating your transformation. Another helpful tip for transforming your objects is to hold Shift when trying to be more accurate. Holding Shift while moving, rotating, or scaling your object will reduce the sensitivity of your cursor affecting the transformation values. In other words, it'll change slower as you move your cursor, giving you more nuanced control over the end result. In fact, holding Shift will achieve the same effect for cursor-dependent values in most other editors as well. For example, dragging a number along a slider. Alright, but what if I have a bunch of boxes that need to be perfectly aligned? Eyeballing it isn't very practical or helpful. This is where you can use the snapping options located at the top here. This magnet icon toggles snapping on and off, but you can also press Shift Tab. The drop-down menu to the right of it allows you to snap to increments, vertices, faces, volumes, or edges. This way, you can align your boxes perfectly to each other without relying on guesswork. Selection and transformation are the foundation of manipulating your 3D scene in Blender. To add an object in Blender, it's really quite simple. Let's say we want to add another mesh. Maybe a torus, for example, or a donut. Simply go to the Add menu in the top left, go to Mesh, and select Torus. For hotkey users, you can simply press Shift A to open your Add menu. You'll notice that the new mesh spawns where the 3D cursor is. This is an important feature of the 3D cursor. I'm sure you've noticed you can add things other than toruses. Inside the Mesh menu alone, you can see all of these primitives here. Most of them are self-explanatory, but you might be curious about what this monkey option is. The monkey is the head of a character called Suzanne. Suzanne is Blender's alternative to more common test models such as the Utah Teapot and the Stanford Bunny. As a low polygon model of only 500 faces, Suzanne is often used as a quick and easy way to test material, animation, rigs, texture, and lighting setups. Fun fact, the largest Blender contest, which takes place at the Blender conference every year, gives out an award called the Suzanne Award. To delete an object, there are 3 ways to do it. Make sure you have the correct object or objects selected, then go to Object, Delete. For hotkey users, you can press X or the Delete key. However, if you press X, you'll get a confirmation message. To confirm, simply left-click or press D. These delete functions also extend to almost every other editor where you can delete things. But it's important to know that the deletion menu in edit mode, for example, can look very different. Instead of a simple confirmation menu, deleting things in edit mode will bring up another menu, which will ask you for more information. For example, you can choose to delete the vertices, the edges, or the faces that you have selected, and each one will do something slightly different. If you delete vertices, it will also delete all connecting edges and faces of the vertices you selected. If you delete edges, it will also delete any faces formed by those edges, but it will not delete any vertices that also share another existing edge. And if you delete faces, it will also delete all edges and vertices within your selection, but not delete any edges or vertices along the boundary of your selection. Deleting only edges and faces will leave your vertices intact throughout your selection, even if they are floating in mid-air. Deleting only faces will leave you all of your edges intact throughout your selection, even if they're floating in mid-air. Dissolve vertices, edges, and faces are operators that try to combine the geometry in a way to act like your selection never existed. It will not always work, but can be very handy for removing loop cuts or extra subdivisions. Edge collapse will collapse all vertices along the boundary of your selection, caving in the geometry where your selection once was. Edge loops will functionally do the opposite of a mesh extrusion. It will reduce your selection geometry down to the next edge loop available. Edit mode has the most complex deletion options available, so while other modes and editors may have similar deletion options, they should be pretty self-explanatory if you can understand these.
Shut up and sit down.